So I was asked with Shelley this morning to be in East London. And guess what we were asked to do? We were asked to be at the coming together of two churches. So right now, in East London, two churches that are very close to our heart are merging together. One that had a history of 22 years, and I had the privilege of being with them last Sunday at their final service as they laid down their own identity, as they laid down a history because they believed that to be together was better than to be apart. And the church that they have merged into, which is also part of our cluster, celebrates its second anniversary today, 22 years, joining the junior partner in years, but saying that's where God's moving, we need to be part of that. So you have spawned something within our cluster. And we're celebrating 1 year here, and in a very real sense this morning in East London, a whole new chapter begins for two groups of people who say that actually multiplication happens when we lay down our separateness and we become one. And I feel like God's going to use Cedar Hill as a catalyst, as an example to many other communities who are struggling with their own identities, who are struggling to try and make an impact, but they know that they have the heart for it. I really believe God's going to start to use you to be a real beacon of hope for people to say it is possible. It is possible to buck the trend. It is possible for us to do something together for the glory of God. We've had an awesome time. And as was the case last year when I was the last of the four speakers that were given the opportunity to speak, I'm the last of the four again. And I nudged Corrine last night and I said, well, what Shelley said last night leaves me no option just to get up and say the benediction. Because even though we are married, we have separate offices in our home, I had no idea of what she was going to speak about, and she took 3/4 of what I wanted to say to you this morning. Even the words nogal. It's not just the concept, but when she starts to pinch the words that I wanted to use. Pardon? One flesh, yeah. But because she spoke first, I'm the one that's embarrassed this morning. And then what little I did have, even in the benediction, Wesley's just gone and blown right now. So I feel like all I've got left to say is say grace for the donuts. I'm not sure how to take that comment. Hallelujah. I do have something to say. It's been an amazing time, hasn't it? Just in the gents this morning, I heard two of our brothers speaking, and they were just saying in Afrikaans, die laaste 3 dae was amazing. And it's been amazing. I knew when I was coming here that God was going to give some words to this church and that there would be a theme and that there would be something distinctive in the sound that was going to be proclaimed over Cedar Hill as we celebrate this first year. One of those words that I've heard coming through over and over and over again is that there is a distinctive identity that settles on this church. Ryan spoke about the fact that we are missional, and that there is a missional identity on this church. George spoke on Friday night about this being the church whose identity is that it hosts the presence of God. Shelley spoke last night, amongst other things, and said the identity of this church is that people were going to be able to see in practice what it means to be one. To be one. Wes has just spoken this morning about the identity of being those who possess a greater land. And I feel like in every sense, if you have to look at my notes this morning, every one of those themes is in here, and I didn't have a clue what the others were going to speak about. But I felt like God was saying, as I began to go before Him earlier in this week, to say, God, what do you want me to say as I have to speak on this birthday and as I, in a sense, wrap up where everybody else has come from? I felt like the Father was simply saying that in order for this church to become everything that was going to be proclaimed over it in this birthday celebration, that I should bring a father's heart into this church today and simply sound not a warning, but an encouragement for us to be able to understand who we are as the individuals who make up this church in order that we can possess that land. So it is not insignificant, Wesley, that the passage of Scripture that I want to talk to you out of this morning, just for the few minutes that remain today, is Joshua chapter 5. And Joshua chapter 5 is the events that follow the crossing of the Jordan River of the generation that is designated by God to take hold of the promised land. I found it really interesting that the Jordan River that they cross over under Joshua's leadership, this new generation leadership, is a Jordan River that's not just a little trickle of water, but it's a floodplain, and there's flood waters all over, and it's a scary place, and yet they ford the Jordan River at the time of flooding. And I found it really interesting that you were flooded out just 2 weeks ago. Felt like God simply saying, in the natural, there's a sound that is coming to this church, and you need to hear, because as much as I flooded this plain, it is a sign that there is a change and a crossing over and a transition that is not at the start of something, but is simply changing gear and going forward into that which God has in His heart for you. So they have to ford the Jordan River. And it would have been as natural as anything, watching this incredible miracle, how the waters bank up on either side, how the priests go and stand on the ground, on the dry ground, and the entire nation moves through untouched by the water, unthreatened by the water, until they get to the other side. An entire nation moves through. It would be not unreasonable to expect that having seen all of this that God was doing and the promises that they carried, that they should immediately move into the promised land and start to possess it. That they should have the confidence to go on and take Jericho and take Ai and take all of those other cities that were in the nearby neighborhood as they moved into the promised land. Because they were powerful. Because they were a nation together. Because they had seen the miraculous in God. It would not be unreasonable to think that they could now go on with a new strategy and simply conquer and conquer and conquer and conquer, because they had confidence, they had pride, they had identity, and they had the promises of God. Yet Joshua chapter 5 is a very different note altogether. It's almost like as they come zooming through the Jordan River, ready to take the promised land, somewhere along the line, God just yanks the handbrake and goes, "Arr!" And the whole nation comes to a standstill, and there's Jericho. They can see it, they can smell it, they can touch it. It's right there within their grasp. Everything that they've been promised, everything that they'd grown up with, expecting and anticipating, is about to be launched, and yet God simply says to them, pause. Pause. And three most unusual events take place as Israel camps in sight of Jericho in Joshua chapter 5, that one would begin to think, how ridiculous is this, God? 40 years of wilderness traveling, 40 years of roaming around, 40 years of preparation, 40 years which culminates with the great leader that they'd all loved dying, and they don't even know where he died, but he just disappeared. A month of mourning and grieving to adjust to the fact that there has to be a new leadership. They ford the river. Joshua proves his credentials. There are young men, the oldest of whom, outside of just two men, Joshua and Caleb, the oldest of whom is 40 years of age. So it's a youthful generation. They're ready to take the land, and God simply says, not yet. Not yet. And in the context of taking the promised land, there are three things that take place. Number one, the men, every one of the men has to be circumcised. Now think, you're 40 and you've got to be circumcised. Every one of the men, that which represents the strength, that which represents the potential, that which represents all that's going to be needed to take the land, is incapacitated for 2 weeks. Totally incapacitated. The second thing that happens is they celebrate the Passover in that new land, and the day after the Passover, the manna stops being delivered. And the third thing that happens is that right in the shadow of Jericho, Joshua goes for a walk and he meets a man standing with a sword in his hand. And he confronts a whole new dynamic to what a new wineskin is going to be for them as a nation. And he has to settle some philosophical and worldview issues right at that point in order to lead the people into the new wineskin. Three things. 3 events. And as I prepared and as I began to think about Cedar Hill, it was like I felt God simply saying, and I can't overemphasize how when Wes phoned me to say to me, the place is flooded, but the damage is contained. And then I saw the video footage and watching it again this morning, seeing how you all rallied to the task to sweep the water out. When I saw all of that water in this place, it was like the Holy Spirit simply said, I've done that, I've allowed that so that you can be sure in your own heart that what you're saying on Sunday morning is right. Felt like God simply saying, it's no longer a case of you having to traverse the Jordan. You did that a year ago. You've done that a year ago. It's taken that long to get through this Jordan. It's taken that long to make sure that everybody's come across. And the leaders have done a great job of ensuring that as many of you have come through to find this new identity. Now we've been given some hints as to what that identity is about. But I want to talk to you this morning about, around those 3 things, about what it is to be a people that are ready to take the promised land, and what it is that God wants to say to you this morning by way of encouragement to get it right so that Jericho gets taken next. Why was it that God put the handbrake on? I think it was for 2 reasons. Number one, because he had to bring about a culture of alignment. He had to make sure that the nation, though defined by their common heritage, though defined by the value systems, though defined by their various approaches to their history, that they suddenly found an alignment and a oneness, and that's been the theme that's come through over and over and over again. We were 3, we're now 1. We've lived in the place of 1 year trying to get to grips with what that one thing is all about. God's simply saying, now we are 1. Now we're Cedar Hill. But there needs to be an alignment in order for us to go forward. There needs to be a oneness in order for us to go forward. So in Joshua chapter 5 and from verse 2 onwards, here's the first of these 3 scenarios. At that time, the Lord said to Joshua, make flint knives and circumcise the sons of Israel a second time. So Joshua made flint knives and circumcised the sons of Israel at Gibeath Ha'araloth. And this is the reason why Joshua circumcised them. All the males of the people who came out of Egypt, all the men of war, had died in the wilderness on the way after they had come out of Egypt. Though all the people who came out had been circumcised, yet all the people who were born on the way in the wilderness after they had come out of Egypt had not been circumcised. For the people of Israel walked 40 years in the wilderness until all the nation, the men of war who came out of Egypt, perished because they did not obey the voice of the Lord. The Lord swore to them that he would not let them see the land, and the Lord had sworn to their fathers to give to us a land flowing with milk and honey. So it was their children whom he raised up in their place that Joshua circumcised, for they were uncircumcised because they had not been circumcised on the way. How does alignment and circumcision work? Well, the reality was Joshua sits in the promised land with a nation that is immature. They're 40 years old, but they're immature. And the fact of their uncircumcision is a reminder to them day after day after day that 2 things are their reality. Number 1, they're out of order, and number 2, they're immature. See, the order of God had to be respected, but a generation that had died in the wilderness was so negligent about respecting the order of God that the very fundamental thing that should have been the responsibility of moms and dads in the house had been overlooked and neglected, and now a whole generation who, though they are old in years, are in their worldview young boys, are about to take on the promised land. They've never matured. They're about to perpetuate all of the same mistakes that their parents had made and that had caused them to die in the wilderness. They are a young generation, but in terms of their linkage to the old generation, there is no distinction. They're unprepared to go into the promised land. And God says, until this thing is sorted out, until this generation gets an understanding of how imperative the order of God is in their lives, they will never begin to succeed in terms of what I have promised and what is about to be exposed to them. Though they were old, they were boys. They were unsuited to move on and to take the land. Their identity as slaves, and with a slave mentality and with a victim mentality, was still tied to their moms and dads, because the uncircumcised flesh tied them indelibly back into that generation. God says, I can't move you on into that which is this new season in your life while you are uncircumcised. I cannot use you to overcome the things that are going to come your way if you're still operating in an old wineskin. I cannot begin to release you to the things that are going to challenge you in the future if you're still tied to old thinking. I cannot release you to be mature representatives of who I am, so that what people see in you are those great oaks of righteousness that we heard about earlier this week, if you're still stumbling around in your faith as little boys and you're not fathers. They may be the generation of promise and destiny, but they were bound by the values, the thinking, and the worldview of a generation that had failed to appropriate everything that God had in mind for them. There's a movie called My Old Lady. My Old Lady. It's one of those weird movies that somewhere along the line I kind of found in a moment of kind of blur. You know, those moments where you just kind of, where, and you find a movie and you think afterwards, what on earth did I waste an hour and a half watching that for? My Old Lady. And Kevin Kline plays the central character in it. And I watched it purely because somewhere along the line he makes a statement that God wanted me to hear. And this is what he says. You look in the mirror and you see an adult, but you have to look more carefully. There's a big piece of you that never grew up. You may have grown tall, but not up. You may have grown tall, but not up. I guess that could be a comment on so much of what we experience in our own lives as we move around and have the privilege in God to move around in churches. We have people who've walked with the Lord for many, many years, and so in that sense, they've grown tall, but they've never grown up. And one of the sounding voices that I believe God is saying to Cedar Hill this morning is, with all of these promises, with all of these prophetic statements, with all of this fantastic oneness that God is weaving amongst us right now, with the positioning of this church, not only in Amanzimtoti, but for far bigger, one of the key releases that will come is when we know that we've grown up, not just tall. When we are a mature people. You see, the generation that died in the wilderness knew all sorts of things about God. They just didn't know God. That generation that died in the wilderness had so many character flaws in spite of the tabernacle being with them, in spite of a highly formed religious event taking place, in spite of doing all that was true in the law. They ticked all of those boxes, yet they were immature because they had not grown up even as they grew tall. And God says to a new nation, you may be 40 years of age and you may have already grown tall, but I am not letting you go into the promised land having only tallness as your character default. I want you to grow up. And so you've got to be circumcised. And the pain and the discomfort and the holding on of the agenda to take the promised land, the break on you for just a while, this period is going to be a constant reminder to you that actually you've grown up and you've not just got tall. The cutting of the skin was a separation from the past identity and a stepping into maturity. The end of those verses, God simply speaks and he says, when the circumcising of the whole nation was finished, they remained in their places in the camp until they were healed. And then the Lord said to Joshua, today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you. And so the name of that place is called Gilgal to this day. I felt so strongly as I was putting this message together, and Shelley referred to maturity last night. That's why I said to you, some of you who were here last night will think that I've stolen her notes. That's one way of looking at it. The other way is saying God's got our number, and he's saying the same thing through everybody else. And he's saying to Cedar Hill this morning, I want you to be mature. I want you to be mature. I felt so strongly, God, simply saying that there would be people in this church this morning who, while you celebrate what God has done and what God is about to do, and while you're excited about all of that, you still operate with an Egypt mentality. And you may even be looked to as a senior. Peter said a wonderful thing when he was giving his testimony this morning. He thought, I was a rock until Sydney came and sat down next to me and began to explore things in my life. And then I realized just how much trouble I was in emotionally. That's a mature man being able to say something of criticism against himself, isn't it? When we can look at ourselves and critique. Folk, how do we expect to be that shining light that Isaiah speaks about, that the kings of this world will be drawn to if we're immature? How will we expect to begin to influence the world if we're still dealing with the baggage of Egypt? See, God had to circumcise this generation because they were the product of an Egypt generation, and an Egypt generation that had brought all of that baggage with them. And God said, that belongs on that side of the Jordan. It cannot go into the promised land because this is a new day. I felt like God simply saying that some of us this morning have to acknowledge the fact that we may have grown tall, but we've not grown up. And that there needs to be a circumcision of our hearts this morning, so that we can say, God, I want to be a mature part of this whole movement forward. Thank you for putting the handbrake on for just a little while so that I can get myself sorted out, so that I can be a contributing factor to this identity that has been spoken of. So they were immature, but they were also spiritually impoverished. They were spiritually impoverished. In verse 10 to 12, Joshua 5 says this, while the people of Israel were encamped at Gilgal, they kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month in the evening on the plains of Jericho. And the day after the Passover, on that very day, they ate the produce of the land, unleavened cakes and parched grain. And the manna ceased the day after that they ate of the produce of the land. And there was no longer manna for the people of Israel, but they ate of the fruit of the land of Canaan that year. So God says, I'm going to deal with your immaturity. I'm cutting the flesh. I'm putting off your shame. I'm taking the embarrassment of being associated with a generation that failed to appropriate the promises of God, that never got to do it. I'm cutting off you that which will be a constant reminder of what an old wineskin was like. I'm taking that off you. But secondly, I'm dealing with other issues in your heart right now, because that generation wasn't just immature, it was also an impoverished generation. See, that generation had developed such a dependency on God, not for the right reasons, but for all the wrong reasons, that they'd become spiritual beggars. That generation defaulted and put the blame for, or the responsibility of, on God for their day by day by day by day existence. See, when they'd gone into Egypt, the Egyptians provided every single thing for them. from building materials to houses to their food. And what they didn't understand was that their identity shrank as a people of God, of the Most High God, and they became beggars because they became dependent on the Pharaoh, a substitute counterfeit God in their lives for their daily needs. And when they emerged from Egypt, they brought all of that emotional baggage with them. So you go and watch the 40 years in the wilderness, and what do you see? Every time there was a challenge, they wanted to go back to Egypt. Every time they came up against something that threatened their welfare, it was better for us to be in Egypt eating the rubbish and making bricks with straw, because at least we had 3 square meals there. Not only had their identity shrunk, but their dependence on God had taken a whole new turn. And now they simply replaced Pharaoh for God as a beggar, rather than a son of God, rather than that royalty that we've been singing of for these 4 days. So the default position of the wilderness generation was this: God, we live in the miracle. We ask, you do. And if you don't do the way we do, then we complain. Then we murmur. Then we riot. Then we protest. Then we throw our toys out of the cot until we can bully you into doing the miracles that will give us water, that will give us food. So manna, as much as uncircumcision, is a tie-in to a generation that God says failed, that God says never delivered on the promises, that God says could not go into the promised land because this next season of possession is going to demand a different kind of person. One that doesn't wheel and scream and whine and demand a miracle. Now, for those of you who were here last night, my wife got in ahead of me, said, have learned how to live in the principles of the kingdom of God. See, folk, I can't get away from, and I love the idea of the miracles, and I love the fact that we're touching God for signs and wonders, and I celebrate as much as anybody does when we see the healings and stuff like that. I cannot get away from the fact that in the New Testament, in the New Covenant, Jesus said, signs and wonders are for a faithless generation, not for the people of God, because we learn to live in the principles. We learn a daily submission, dependence, a wholesome dependency on God. And the miracles and the signs and wonders, while they may be wonderful and we see the healings, that should cause the world to come running to say, He is the God who He says He was. Because you know what happened in the wilderness? The demand for miracles got shorter and shorter and shorter by way of interval, because the needs got greater and greater the further they went. And not only did they get closer and closer in terms of their demand, but God had to perform more and more and more and more spectacular miracles for them to trust Him. Mature people begin to mine the Word of God for what are the principles that are so obvious that I'm not putting in place in my life. Immature people are simply saying, it's God's responsibility for my welfare. It's God's responsibility for my good. It's God's responsibility for my happiness. Now, in a sense, that's true. It's true. But how can I stand and begin to demand and murmur and complain and become self-centered in terms of putting the responsibility on God when God says, well, I've given you some very clear clues as to how to live so that you don't get yourself into the place where you have to have a miracle to bail you out over and over and over. Folk, how on earth are we going to provoke the kings of this world to come to us for the answers if we've got to run to God for a miracle all the time because we don't know how to get ourselves into a place where we can speak? This is not shambak time. This is encouragement time, just in case you're wondering. I'm sharing my heart with you. Wesley said, talk to us today as a dad. I hope you're hearing that. Are you? Because if not, I've got to change the tone here a little. See, I'm wanting to provoke us this morning for the fact that we are expectant for the miracles, but not for our benefit, but for a faithless generation to be able to praise our God because they're seeing the miracles in tandem with a people of God who are living in the principles. See, we're looking for miracles to bail us out when God is simply saying, man, it starts with simple things like loving one another, being fully committed to each other. Like Marvin said so well this morning, living with a generous spirit, not a miserly spirit. With us taking responsibility, as has been the theme over the 3 nights so far, for our community. For not leaving it up to the Amanzimtoti municipality to go and pick up all of the rubbish that has come down the river onto the beaches and that, but to say, whether we get the recognition or not, we are a people that believes the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, and therefore because plastic is on the beach, it's our responsibility because that's a disgrace to God. And then not stopping there, folk, and saying, where is all this plastic coming from? It's coming from upstream somewhere. How's it getting into our river systems and things like that? What is the problem upstream, and how do we become the solution to that? See, that's the principles. We need the miracle in order, as Tony Fitzgerald always says, to take us to the place where we learn how to live in the principles so that we can teach other people to expect miracles so that they can learn how to live in the principles. And God says to this new generation, I want you to be dependent on me for the right reasons and in the right way. Not because you murmur, not because you demand, not because it's about you focused and getting more of what you've already got. But it's because you want the miracles so that the faithless generation can give me glory. So there's a great challenge to a generation that had been born into the provision of manna. Imagine that. You got born into a culture where God provided manna every day. Now you're on the other side of the Jordan and you have manna around your Passover meal, and the next day, oops, there's no manna. But God says, I've got something much better for you. When you learn to live in the principles, you eat of the produce of the promised land. And that which has fed you and maybe nourished you right now is nothing in comparison to the reward that comes from living in the promises of God and the principles of God. Because they ate grapes and they ate wheat and they drank great water and all of the fruits that came from the promised land. So there had to be an alignment. God had to say, I'm taking this new group. I'm putting aside the shame, I'm putting aside the embarrassment, I'm putting aside the failures of the past, and I'm bringing you now as a new generation into a place where you will have your own identity, where you won't be immature, but you will be mature, and you won't have to look for the miracles all the time because you're going to live in the consequences of the principles. We had to align with that. We have to align with that. And Cedar Hill, part of the reason that God is putting a slight handbrake on all of this and not releasing you to the point where you can just take over everything is God says, you can do all of that, but I want you to do it as mature people. I want you to do it as people with head held high. I want you to be able to do it as people who simply say, my glory and the lifter of my head, not my sham. I'm embarrassed because I'm tied in. God's saying, I want to do that new thing. And if you need to have a heart circumcised, that's what I'm doing today. I'm aligning you. I'm aligning you. I'm aligning you. So the handbrake was there for alignment, but the second thing that God wanted to do as a fundamental thing in the life of this new generation was he needed to bring them to a place of adjustment. Alignment and adjustment. Verse 13 to 15. When Joshua was by Jericho, he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing before him with his drawn sword in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, are you for us, or are you our adversaries? And the man answered, no, but I am the commander of the army of the Lord. Now I have come. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth, and he worshipped, and he said to him, what does my Lord say to his servant? And the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy. And Joshua did so. Folk, taking this promised land ground was going to demand a total adjustment of the way that this new generation thought, reasoned, and approached the various challenges that they would come across as they came into this promised land. See, they didn't know what was ahead of them. Had no idea. They were a people that were conditioned for wilderness conditions. They knew how to survive in the wilderness. They knew how to get around. They'd walked around for 40 years. Now suddenly, everything that had always been out there as a hope to have one day was right in front of them. And they had all the promises of God stacked up on them. But God says, I've got to stop you here for just a moment, because now this is not just a promise. This is a reality. You're in the land. It's happening. And I just want you to know, the way that you existed in the wilderness is not the way that you're going to exist in the promised land. You've got to change the way you think. You've got to change the way you approach things and the way that you reason in the promised land. So we have this picture that when God gives us what we're asking for, God puts us in the promised land, everything is hunky-dory. And it's kind of, we park our brain for a moment. And God says, no. What awaits you is going to ask you to adjust your thinking. That's why we've had to put off your flesh. That's why we've got to make such a distinction from the way in which you used to be on the other side of the Jordan River. We cannot afford any longer to do so in a one-track mind or way. It's complicated. It's not the same as it used to be. I said last week, as I was with the folk that we were closing down and readying them to emerge into our Impact Church this morning, I said to them, 40 years ago this year, January 1979, I entered seminary. A young 21-year-old. Bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, ready to take the world. Ready for 4 years of study. And over those 4 years, I was taught all sorts of skills that prepared me to be a pastor. Nobody ever factored in that I wasn't actually meant to be a pastor, that there was this apostolic life in my life. Nobody knew how to prepare me for that. And secondly, everything that I was prepared for in so many ways belonged to a world that no longer exists and is no longer relevant to 2019. The ethical standards and the ethics that we used to wrestle with in those days are so archaic in these days that I wonder what sometimes the worth of even doing a course like that was. Better that I had been taught how to reason and how to think rather than what to think. Because I came out of 4 years of seminary and I bless God for my training, and I thank God and I honor the men and God who put into my life over those years. So I'm not demeaning the fact that I did any theological training. But you know what? I came out as the product of a seminary that taught me what to think, and I had a one-track mind without an ability to be flexible, to make the reasoned gymnastics to be relevant to a day-to-day. I've had to work hard on finding out for myself what does the gospel mean in vastly different challenges that present themselves to us as the church in 2019. I could have described Jericho to you until I got into the lee of Jericho, as this generation had done. They knew about Jericho. They didn't know how to take it. Joshua's encounter with this man standing near Jericho with his sword drawn asks the obvious one-track question, coming from the normality of his context. He asks an either-or question. Are you either with us or are you with our adversaries? And the man with the drawn sword answers him in a most ridiculous way. He refuses to be drawn into the either-or, and he simply says no. And at that point, Joshua doesn't know what to say. Because we're conditioned to working in either this or that. That's what one-track thinking does. We're conditioned, folk, to living our lives in a black and white world, when the world has said, we don't like black and white, we like gray. And our black and white answers don't always work anymore in the grays. And God says to his people, I've put off the shame of the past, but I've also broken the mindsets or the way in which you think and the way in which you reason from the past. And I'm giving you a new opportunity to take the same truth that never changes, but to package it in such a way that it makes sense in a gray world. I'm giving you a grace. Because so often the kings of the world are not coming to the church where the light actually is because they find judgment rather than grace. They find judgmentalism rather than acceptance. And they find preconceived answers to questions that they're not asking, but we're giving them those answers anyway because we're not listening. And God says to this new generation, the strategies that I'm going to give you to take this promised land, if I had to tell you about them right now without you being circumcised, without you having the Passover, without you getting yourself aligned and having a breather to start adjusting your mindset, if I had to tell you what's coming by way of strategy, you'd run back over the Jordan River. Because who in their right mind says you take on the might of Jericho with some priests out the front with their trumpets, and the guys that do have the swords who don't actually know how to use them anyway because they've never fought a battle in their lives, and they go with the sword strapped to their side, and God says that's just for show anyway, you're not going to use them because actually the trumpet blast and your singing is going to bring down those walls. Who taught you that in military school? Who taught you that as a military strategy? And then just in case you think the priest can blow the trumpet and you can just march behind them and sing some happy, wonderful, latest choruses, and Ai will be defeated. Now, let me tell you this. Ai is going to be taken totally differently. Oh, you didn't listen, did you? You thought the priest could do this. You were so chuffed with yourselves that you got one little victory that you thought you didn't have to depend on me and you didn't have to listen. You see, you're thinking either or. And God's saying no. He brings his commander of the army and then he's saying flatly, no. He says, this is the day of the neithers. It's neither either nor or for those who will be listening for my strategy. So God, how do we take a manzimtoti? Oh, it's either us being out there on the front page of the local newspaper, we're picking up plastic, we're doing this, we're doing that, or, and God saying, actually it's neither of those. Sometimes we've just got to be under the radar doing things, and we don't have to worry who gets the glory, who brand is out there. Let other guys get that. Other religions are out there, and they plaster their names all over this. So Jesus said, you're the salt of the earth. You're the light of the world. Yes, you show yourselves, but man, there's a time and a place. It's the neithers. See, we're going to be voting this week. How do we reason that? The new generation doesn't reason it from emotion. Not getting my fears in place. Not suspending my logic. I'm not letting populism weigh me. I'm going before God and I'm saying, God, when I look at all of those parties, where best am I seeing your plan being able to be put into place in this nation for your glory? Our rand may tank. Investors may be worried. God, I'm not going to be worried about those kind of things. My critical decision is going to be based on the fact that I'm secure in you. My identity is in you. I know where we're going. And I'm reasoning from that base. It's a new abnormal. This out-of-the-box thinking would be their saving grace when it came to these outrageous strategies. Folk, we don't live in a place any longer where we've got pat answers. No pat answers. God was showing that a new generation that is mature enough in its identity in Christ to adapt to ever-changing scenarios facing it, secure in the knowledge of what that truth was, but flexible enough to apply that truth to every new challenge it confronts, was going to be that generation that would emerge. You've been most gracious. It's been a long morning. I'm going to say grace for donuts in a moment. And we're going to celebrate. Because there is so much to celebrate. But folk, just for one moment, Wesley, may I forgot to ask you before I did, can I just minister into this for just 3 minutes? Can I? I want you just to close your eyes for a moment. If somebody could just play keyboard for me, not because I need mood music and kind of, ooh, no, thanks, Gerardus. But I've just come to realize over the many years that I've been in ministry now that sometimes just through the sensitive addition and segue in of some music, God is able to just release something into our lives as we contemplate. I just want you to close your eyes. I really do believe, and I'm not saying this now as just the thing to say, but I really do believe that Cedar Hill is not about to go into something. I know you're already in it. You've crossed that Jordan. For many of you, it was a very scary thing, as you've heard this morning. Cedar Hill has started to develop its own identity, and I'm so grateful for that. Just the grace of God dropping in every now and again with some of these incredible miracles in the house of healing, and prophesied on Friday night you would be a house that will host the presence of God. Isn't that wonderful? That's more of an affirmation of what's already here as a first fruit rather than, whoa, this has still got to come in the now, by and by. It's here. I just feel like God is giving us a pause moment. He's just hit the pause button for just a moment to say, before we go on, let's just get the alignment and the adjustment right. It took me a long while in my own life to come to the place of recognizing, and I was a pastor, I was a spiritual leader. It took me a long while to come to the place of acknowledging in my own life that there were so many areas where I was still immature because I was linked into things in the past that had shamed me, that had embarrassed me, that had let me down. And you know, the net result of that, folk, was that it held me back. I had one bad experience of speaking to a bunch of young people when I should never have gone to speak. I was as sick as anything. It had backfired badly. I was so embarrassed. I was so ashamed that I would never speak to young people again. I avoided any kind of invitation to address young people's groups until God had to bring a measure of healing. He had to circumcise my heart to put off the shame and the embarrassment of the failure. Some of you have been traumatized by past experiences. You've been disillusioned by God because you've trusted Him for things, and how you expected Him to work has not worked out, and you've been held back. And God's saying this morning, you know, I understand all of those things, but actually all that does is it proves to me that you've grown tall, but you've not grown up. I want you to grow up. I want you to be mature today. I need to circumcise your heart and cut off the nonsense that has held you back. Cut off the shame, cut off the embarrassment, cut off the linkages. For some of you, you have resisted living in the principles of God because all you've ever been conditioned to do is to have to believe God for a miracle at the end of every month. While God is saying, it's staring you in the face. Here are the principles. Start living by the principles. Align your life with the principles, and you will not need the miracle. And then you can become a custodian of miracles for the faithless generation. Some of us this morning have to make a major mindset shift and say, God, I've lived so often in the either-ors. For me, I'm actually sometimes even bigoted. I'm judgmental because I have such hard and fast opinions on things, and I back them up biblically. And then I wonder why nobody is actually able to understand what I'm saying, or wanting to approach me, or wanting my counsel, because I might have the truth in my head, but my character stinks. The way I apply it stinks. I'm not flexible enough to allow you to give me new strategies. I'm just gung-ho to apply everything that I've always applied. It's a momentary handbrake that says to Cedar Hill this morning, alignment, adjustment. I don't often do this, folk. I really don't often do this. But in the worship this morning, just before I came as well, I felt God simply say, you need to provide just a moment for people to come to the front and have their heart circumcised, to cut off the shame, cut off the reproach, break the linkage to a past mindset. Take a stand and say, God, I'm not going to be looking for the miracles. I'm stepping into the principles this morning. God, I need to have your flexibility to be able to reason and to think critically, to apply your word in these days. Rion bumped me, and I'm not going to call him up right now, but he just told me the gist of what God showed him yesterday as he was in his quiet time. He's been reading through Ephesians, and he said God showed him 3 things about Ephesians. There's 3 different sections that Ephesians talks about in the beginning, that we sit with the Lord. It then goes on to talk and describe about how we walk in the Lord. Stand in the Lord, sorry. And the third part is how we walk in the Lord. God wants us to move from a place of sitting into standing and into walking this morning. I know you'll understand if the donuts wait for just a moment or 3 longer. I'd rather you miss a donut than miss an opportunity to circumcise your heart. So Wes, with your permission, I'm just asking today, if this word has meant anything to you, if you're recognizing, God, I've grown tall, but I've not grown up, won't you come and stand at the front and allow God to circumcise your heart this morning and say, God, I want to be mature. I want to be mature. I'm tall, but I'm not up. If you've become so dependent on God for all the wrong reasons that you have to have a miracle every single day, every single month to get you out of where you're at, why don't you guys just come forward a little bit just to make a bit of space? But today you're declaring, God, as a new generation person, I'm going to step from the miracles into the principles. I'm making a declaration. I'm going to live by your principles. Come and stand here. Because sometimes in the physical stepping out and coming to stand in the front, there's just a declaration into the heavens that makes it far more important and real. And if you have to come this morning and say, God, I'm so set in my thinking, so set in my answers, so judgmental in the way that I have opinions on things that you're saying to me is a different world today, that if people have to listen to me, they're going to run from the church rather than to the church to find the answers. I need to make a shift this morning in my mind. Come and stand here and let's ask God just to break your mindsets. Not the truth, but the mindsets that hold you back, and give you the flexibility of becoming a powerhouse of God to apply the truth of God into the circumstances that may shock us at times, may shock us to the core, may make us want to run from it. But God says, if you run from it, who is there to be the light? Who is there to be the salt? There are things going on in our world that I can't even begin to wrap my head around. They are so outside of my paradigm, so outside of my context. But I'm learning day by day by day to say, God, if you can use me, then will you deal with my prejudices? Will you deal with my preferences? Will you deal with my judgmentalism? Will you deal with my heart? Because God, I might be the only person who makes sense to that person who's looked everywhere else for making sense. I just want to ask those of you standing in the front, won't you just put your hands in front of you? Just receive this morning. Just receive this morning. Just want to ask some of the folk that are not having to come and stand up here, because this has not been for you, but those of you who are sons in this house, won't you just, as far as you can, just come and stand and just put a hand on the folk in the front here, just to make them know that they're loved. This is a house of love. This is a family. The folk here are no more broken than we are. They're just acknowledging that these are the areas that need to be mended. So those of us who are putting hands on you, we're not any better or further down the line. We're just simply saying God hasn't spoken to us in those areas. Maybe we've got a little bit more victory in that than you have, but we want to come and stand with you and believe with you. as you stand with your hands in front of you this morning. Father, I want to pray for every one of our brothers and sisters here. I thank you that they're in this house. I thank you that they're here this morning to hear this word. I thank you that they, Lord, are those who are destined to be part of this new generation of possessors. Not those who see it, Lord, but those who get it. Not those who hear about it promised, but those who walk into it. Not those, Father, who only ever think of it in the sweet by and by, but those who experience it right now. And I thank you that as you mature them, as they grow up, not just tall, as they come to steward your principles so that they can become incredible stewards of the miracles for others' benefit, as they have their mindsets changed, as they become powerhouses to be able to have and to be ready for an answer in season and out of season. That, Father, where my brothers and sisters find themselves on Mission Monday, Mission Tuesday, Mission Wednesday, Mission Thursday, Mission Friday, Mission Saturday, Mission Sunday, my God, that people will be drawn to them because of the light that is in them, because of the reason that is in them, because of the critical thinking that is in them, because of the Holy Spirit hovering all over them and giving them those answers that bring light and deliverance into people's lives. Oh, my dear brothers and my dear sisters, I bless you this morning. I bless you as you take this step. Your Jericho may be waiting for you, but there's a strategy that God's going to say. When the evil one comes and says, that meant nothing on Sunday, you're no more mature tomorrow than you were yesterday, God's giving you the strategy to push him back and to answer him. When the end of the month comes and there's still just as much need as there ever was last month, and you say, these principles of God are not working, I need the miracle, God's going to give you the strategy to be able to say, but the principles. And the need for the miracle will become less and less and less, and the principles become more and more and more. God's going to give you the ability as you go into those Mission Monday scenarios. It's going to give you the ability, the wherewithal, the strength, the flexibility of your thinking to surprise yourself at how much wisdom there has been downloaded into you, how much your heart has been broken for the scenarios that you would have been judgmental against, that you would have pushed away. Now God is drawing you right into it, and the people that would have only ever seen you as a religious bigot are going to see you as one who comes with the grace and the love and the goodness and the kindness of a Jesus who sees the humanity behind the adjective, rather than allowing the adjective to say, those aren't the kind of people that I need to be with. And I bless you with all of that this morning.